Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPD to advance excellent teaching.
Are you concerned about teacher quality?
Kids have a right to be taught by someone who knows what they're teaching and how to teach it to children, because the kids are going to be held accountable.
Is government doing enough to provide qualified teachers?
The question in this country is, do we treat teaching as a public good? And if so, what's the role of government in supporting teaching and the preparation of teachers?
What is the best way to prepare teachers?
Knowing your content is a beginning for teaching well, but it's only a small part. We know lots of people who are very expert in their field who can't teach their way out of a paper bag.
I'm John Merrow. How good are most classroom teachers? How good is teacher training? Nobody in the United States spends more time thinking about those questions and working for improvement than Linda Darling-Hammond, Executive Director of the National Commission on Teaching and America's Future, a professor of education at Stanford University, and my guest on this edition of In the Spotlight. Everyone from the president on down is warning us about a teacher shortage. We're being told that many of our teachers do not know the material they're supposed to be teaching, and that teacher training is, for the most part, mediocre. At the same time, politicians are pushing for higher standards for students. This sounds like a recipe for disaster, but there are solutions, according to Linda Darling-Hammond of the National Commission on Teaching and America's Future. Linda and I got together one spring afternoon in her office at Stanford University. I'd just come from Georgia, from high schools where 20% of the teachers were teaching subjects they had not studied. Nationally, about 4 million secondary school students are being taught essential subjects, math, English, and science, by teachers who have not studied what they're teaching. It's called out-of-field teaching, and I asked Linda about it.
A kid in Minnesota has a very good chance of being taught by somebody very highly qualified. A child in Louisiana has about a 50-50 chance of being taught by somebody who is not fully prepared in their content area and in teaching and learning. So it's all over the map. In the United States, 50-some% of kids taking physics are taught by a teacher who's out of field, for example. That's not it's not as egregious in some other fields, but there has been relatively little attention to the issue of ensuring that kids get access to teachers who know what they are teaching and how to teach it well.
We're going to do a writing assignment today. We're going to put it in your folder.
Out-of-field teaching is very common. If you can't easily find somebody who's readily available, who knows math, you just assign somebody, who was hired to teach PE or whatever it may be. And it's symptomatic of places that have not begun to understand that what teachers know matters to what they teach. And in some states you would find almost none of that. And in other states you'll find quite a lot of it. And it really has to do with a culture of education, a culture about teaching and what schooling is about and what folks care about in their schools that doesn't always value knowledge of the content and the ability to teach it.
If you ask the principal, he'll say, well, I just couldn't find the teacher I needed. But what you're suggesting is that maybe that principal has an attitude of interchangeable parts?
We adopted in the early part of the century the Henry Ford assembly line model for organizing schools, where you put the kids on the conveyor belt, you pass them along, the workers implement the same thing over and over again. And we structured teaching around that idea, we structured schools around that idea. We began to believe that teachers would just be interchangeable parts, that you give them a curriculum, they stamp the kids with the curriculum, there's no expertise needed, there's no particular learning opportunity for teachers needed, there are no problematics of teaching, all you do is get through the book, get through the curriculum. That idea is very well rooted in American schools, and it has led to a whole lot of outcomes for us today that are no longer tenable. I argue, and the Commission on Teaching that I directed argue, that kids have a right to be taught by someone who knows what they're teaching and how to teach it to children, because the kids are going to be held accountable increasingly for knowing that material.
Everybody's talking about a teacher shortage. Supposedly we have one now, and it's going to be worse. The problem is acute in urban schools. Low pay and poor working conditions drive away many teachers, while overcomplicated hiring procedures keep some good teachers out. A lot of the teacher shortage amounts to what Linda Darling-Hammond calls a self-inflicted wound.
In general, we actually have teacher surpluses in this country. We actually produce more teachers every year than we hire. And there are some fields where there are difficulties, in terms of the scope. But in general, we have lots of teachers. We have real problems in getting them to where they're needed, treating them well in the hiring process, keeping them in the profession, and all those other things that would take advantage of the people who want to teach.
¿Sí? ¿Van a seguir jugando?
Part of the shortage problem is that we have a distribution problem. The need for teachers is in California and Texas and Florida. The surplus of teachers is produced in Minnesota and Maine and Connecticut and Kansas. We can't get people from where they're trained to where they're needed because we don't have any kind of comparability in licensing or expectations or quality standards across the country. Imagine if we ran medicine that way. The states that have the big medical schools would have a lot of doctors. The other states would not have nearly enough doctors. We'd have no way to get them, where they're needed. It would be crazy. A lot of the problem of teacher hiring is really about teacher retention. If you're in a district where beginning teachers are treated poorly, given the most challenging classes in the most difficult schools with the least support, the greatest number of prep periods, and all the rest of it, you're going to have an attrition rate of more than 50% of those people leaving almost as fast as they come in. For example, right across the bay here in California, there are two districts, one of which has quite an adequate supply of well-qualified teachers. They're involved in teacher preparation, teacher recruitment. They take their budget, which is not a very large budget. They spend most of it on teacher salaries. They put money into maintaining mentors for beginning teachers so they don't lose them. And they have a very, very highly qualified teaching force. Right up the bay from them is a district that spends more money overall in education, has more money available to them. Teacher salaries are about a third lower than in the other district. The hiring process is arcane and almost impossible to manage. There is very little support for beginning teachers. Many of them come in without adequate training to begin with, so they're struggling from the beginning. They don't get support. 60% of them leave within a few years, sometimes months, of having entered. Both of them are in the same labor market. One of them is able to find and hire good teachers. The other really spends almost no effort on finding, supporting, retaining good teachers. And guess what? They have a shortage.
So it's a self-inflicted wound. They could do better.
Absolutely.
Good afternoon, Oakland Unified School District.
It's also the case in a lot of big districts, although certainly not all of them, that the hiring process itself is the most torturous thing you've ever encountered. In one district that we studied through the National Commission, they had a 62-step hiring process to become a teacher before they had overhauled the system. It's not unusual to spend months and months and months getting your fingerprints, putting your file in, having your file lost, standing in line for an interview, having your interview canceled, rescheduling it, and so on and so forth, just trying to get a district that ought to want to hire a well-qualified person to even consider them. In business, in a well-functioning business, it would never be tolerated. I mean, the idea that you supposedly have a shortage or a need for people and can't even manage to process their paperwork efficiently to, interview and hire them, would be unthinkable. But that is, in fact, the case in a lot of the districts that cry shortage the loudest.
America's public schools employ a lot of people, but it seems that many of them are not working in classrooms. Instead, they're assigned to the district office, where they're carrying out administrative tasks. It's sometimes called the administrative blob. I wondered if other countries ran their public schools the same way.
If you looked at schools in many parts of Asia or Europe, you'd find that 70 or 80% of the people who are hired by school systems are classroom teachers. In the United States, 43% of the people hired by school systems are classroom teachers. They're paid at levels that are not competitive in the marketplace, in contrast to many other countries that we would think of as peers and competitors. Then we hire lots of people who we pay more money to tell teachers what to do, to look over their shoulders, to inspect and supervise the work of teaching, as though somehow, by doing all of that, we could actually improve the quality of what goes on in the classroom. So that's a real problem for us now. As standards go up, as the content gets more challenging, as kids are more diverse and we need more and more strategies to be sure that they learn, we can't teacher-proof the curriculum, the learning process, in a way that's going to produce achievement unless we invest in very knowledgeable teachers.
Despite all the criticisms of public education, Linda's a defender of the system, which she feels is misunderstood. People don't think enough about social priorities, she told me.
Society is saying to some kids, we don't care whether you learn, because we're not willing to fix this problem. There's a bigger social cost that I don't think too many people are thinking about either. At this point, basically in a state like California, prison expenditures went up by 900% in the last decade. Public school costs went up by about 25% in real dollar terms. There are 3 times as many people in prison. Nationally, there are more young African American men in prison than in higher education. And we're saying to a lot of kids who are in exactly the schools that you've seen and we've talked about, we'd rather spend $30,000 a year to send you to prison at the other end of school than to put the resources in place to ensure that you get teachers who can actually help you graduate from high school and get a job.
If Linda had her way, America would be subsidizing teacher training. That is, actually help pay the college tuition of people who were studying to become teachers.
If you were in France, Germany, Luxembourg, the cost of becoming a teacher would be pretty much underwritten by the government. There would be an investment in high-quality preparation programs. It wouldn't be up to the candidate to dig up the money out of their pocket to go into a field that pays so little to get access to those programs. And there would be an expectation that the universities would support the programs that have been designed and developed to ensure that all teachers get access to the kind of knowledge they need. Here, we just leave it all up to the whims of the marketplace and the individual candidates.
So you'd say the answer is subsidizing?
Part of the answer, because this is a low-paying profession in relation to others, is ensuring that people who are willing and able to go into teaching have support for their education. And that does mean a role of the government in subsidizing that, as you would see in most other places that take this kind of work seriously across the world.
Linda's a professor of education. Part of her job is training teachers. She knows that many of the country's 1,300 teacher training institutions do a second-rate job.
The traditional model, which I could caricature as take a bunch of courses that don't relate to one another while you're going through undergraduate school. You take classroom management before you've ever been in a classroom. You take methods of teaching before you've ever seen a child. None of it's very tightly hooked up to anything else. You wait till the end of your senior year. You go out for 8 to 10, maybe 12 weeks of student teaching. You go into a classroom where the teacher doesn't know what you've been studying in the university and where what she's doing may have nothing to do with anything you've heard about thus far, which you've probably forgotten since you never applied it. That model doesn't work. Clearly what happens is, you've got a jumble of ideas, none of it's coherent, it doesn't add up, it's not applied at the time that you're learning it, and you end up going into the field and teaching in the way you remember your own 6th grade teacher teaching, if that's what you're about to do.
And then what is the 2? 12 minus 9? 3.
Done well, teacher training takes some resources. Many colleges, however, have basically used the tuitions that large numbers of college students studying education bring with them to fund the medical school, the law school, the business school, and the other parts of the university, because they bring in a lot more money in education tuitions than they spend on the quality of the programs.
We'll bring all the groups together.
In this country, the most well-developed models of teacher education that have been found to actually produce teachers who are more effective are accomplished in a 5-year program of undergraduate and graduate education combined.
So I major in some real thing.
You major in a real discipline, and while you're doing that, you're also taking courses in how to teach that discipline, how people learn and develop and so on. And in the 5th year, after you finished your undergraduate year, there's usually a year-long internship in a school working with a master teacher who really demonstrates the kind of practices while you're also finishing up courses in methods and so on.
So I'm going to read the beginning part of it just so we can get the feel of what a letter is like.
Is teaching an art or a science? Linda says it's both. And while content matters, it's not enough to know your subject. You have to know how to teach.
Knowing your content is a beginning for teaching well, but it's only a small part. We know lots of people who are very expert in their field who can't teach their way out of a paper bag, who cannot help another person learn what it is they know. If I don't know a variety of ways to present a concept so that different people can get at it, I'm not likely to help them learn. If I don't understand aspects of their development, I'm going to present information at a time or in a way that's not accessible to them. So all of those things about child development, about human learning, about cognition, about assessment. How do I figure out what the kids know and don't know? And then what do I do about it? Once I've discovered that a lot of the kids didn't grasp the concept, I then have to have a way of diagnosing why they didn't understand it and then figuring out how to present it so they can understand it. It's a very different thing that we're asking teachers to do today than it was 50 years ago when we just said, go through the book. Some kids will get it, some won't. Those who don't get it, sorry for you. You know, you leave school. You go get a job in the factory.
Colleges of education used to be the only source of new teachers. That's changing.
What do we have to understand about being a teacher that's going to make us an effective
In some places, adults starting second careers in the classroom can take what amounts to a crash course in how to teach. There are about 120 of these so-called alternative certification programs around the country, many of them in California, New Jersey, and Texas. Some people say the answer is competition for schools of education, alternative certification programs.
Some people are lobbying for quicker and shorter routes into teaching, alternatives through school districts. There have been a lot of those things tried. It's not new. It was tried in the 60s. It was tried in the 40s. You know, we have a lot of research on it. Basically, what you find over and over again is that people who are prepared through school district-based programs and alternative routes that are quick fixes not only enter teaching at lower rates and stay at lower rates, very high attrition rates, but are less effective with kids. It makes a difference. And so we could want to try to do it faster and cheaper, but so far we haven't figured out a way to do that.
Well, Linda's wrong. Linda has the sort of brain surgeon view of teaching, that you have to have gone through highly specialized professional training before you should be turned loose on kids.
Chester Finn, a conservative who worked in Ronald Reagan's education department, believes people do not need to go to a school of education to learn how to teach. They need to know their subjects.
And she tends to downplay both subject matter knowledge, though she will acknowledge that they need some of it, and also alternative kinds of people. She has a highly professionalized notion that you should enter through a classic route and then spend your whole life in this profession. Most backers of alternative certification also believe that we ought to have lots of different kinds of teachers in this society, that it is not necessary for everyone to spend 30 years at it, that you can have, if you can get 5 great years of teaching out of somebody, either before they go to business school or after they've finished a military career or something else, you ought to. We don't have to have everybody in this for their whole life.
Texas has regions. Those regions have set up training programs, and so they'll bring in people who are older, generally, looking for a career change, and those people spend the year taking classes, but while they're in a classroom also.
As teacher of record, and that's the issue, because somebody who goes in as teacher of record is doing two things. There are three things going on there that are problematic. One is a group of kids are being put at risk for somebody who's using them as guinea pigs while they learn to teach. And we wouldn't do that in medicine, for example. Say, well, while you're, figuring out how to do surgery, would you just practice in this hospital? Meanwhile, and get some practice cutting on people. The second problem is that they don't get student teaching, which means they never practice in the classroom of a master teacher whose work they can see in action and whom they can model. They're mostly trying to do trial and error. Rather than functioning under the wing of someone who can mentor them. And the third thing is that they're taking courses because they're disconnected from that student teaching situation that are less coherent. And I think it's probably for those reasons that the studies on programs like that continue to find that the teachers are not as effective.
Which would you prefer? The traditional 4-year campus-based model.
How big is one half?
With practice teaching at the end that you've talked about, that you caricatured. Would you prefer that model or a good alternate route into teaching?
I can't answer it because I've seen such variability in alternate routes. It depends on what.
No.
I'm not answering that question that way, John, because it's a bad question. You've got alternate routes into teaching that frankly teach teachers malpractice, stuff that constitutes malpractice, that is not professionally defensible. And you've got some programs that are very defensible. You have to look at what's inside the program, what kind of content are they teaching, how are they doing it, what's the accountability for coaching that teacher, who's evaluating their teaching, what standards are they using. We treat this so simplistically, mostly because we haven't got a system of standards in place that people are responding to say, whatever you call it, does it meet the standards?
I think that 200 years of private school history proves her wrong. Parents pay quite a lot of money to have their kids taught by people who have never been near a pedagogy course in their life, have never set foot in an ed school. Parents pay $15,000 a year to have their kids subjected to what Linda would regard as unqualified teachers. Why? Because these people know their stuff and they're actually very effective with kids. They haven't gone through an ed school, though.
The key thing, if you're going to protect children in the process of preparing teachers, is that any route to teaching you design, number one, should not put people in classrooms as teacher of record until they've demonstrated that they're safe with children, number one. Number two, you've got to have standards for what the knowledge is that person should acquire and how they should demonstrate that they have mastered those skills. And that can't be short-circuited.
Someone watching this might say, Linda Darling-Hammond, monopolist. She's just protecting the ed school monopoly.
Yeah. It's a difficult argument. The ed school establishment today has a lot of low-quality activity in many places, certainly not uniformly. Variability is huge. We don't have standards that are being enforced. That's just what medicine was like in 1910. It was all over the map. On the other hand, if there are important things to know about teaching, and if we know that some places do it well and teachers come out more effective with kids, the answer to that is not to say let's ignore getting prepared to teach. The answer is let's raise the standard in the profession. Medical schools are a monopoly. Law schools are a monopoly. Architecture schools are a monopoly. Why does society let them function as a monopoly, if you will? Because they have put in place standards. They are adamant that every school will meet the standards or be closed. They have licensing standards that are attached to the knowledge base and effectiveness in the field. Everyone has to pass those standards or they cannot practice. And the public feels protected by that to some extent, to a much greater extent than we have in teaching. The issue is, do we care about to me, the issue is, do we care about all of the kids who are in all the classrooms? And do we think they have a right? Do we think their parents have a right to be sure that the teacher in the classroom knows certain things and can do certain things before they start messing around with the kids?
We created In the Spotlight to give you the opportunity to hear more from people like Linda Darling-Hammond, people who are working to improve education and the lives of children. I'm John Merrow. Thanks for joining us.
Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching. For information about this and other Annenberg CPB programs, call 1-800-LEARNER and visit us at www.learner.org.